You heard that. It's time to get going. And what we're going to do this week, it is that time again. We've got another unit pretty much done. We've gone up to the end of the 19th century and beginning the 20th. And, you know, the 19th century is really so much about technology. It's about how new technologies really change the way we look at media, about the growth of newspapers, which really was the first big mass media. And then as this mass medium evolves and gets powerful, big, powerful independent media starts to have some real effects on society.
The industrial age.
Industrial, yeah. And you know what? Media started the industrial age. The printing press was really one of the first manufactured, machine, because it turned out copies of things rather than make things individually. If you think about it, something manufactured is copies of other things. So yes, industrial revolution, the communications revolution, and it's continued to this day. Anyway, your textbook does a pretty decent job out of it. Covered this era in chapters 2 and 7. And this is, chapter 2 is mostly about print, chapter 7 is about the telegraph and beyond. So anyway, 50 questions, open book, open notes. I've been posting class notes with a real list of what we're trying to do here. I'm trying to do a better job for you all. I'm trying to kind of focus on the important things. And in this case, the important things are industrialization, the rise of literacy, and the effects and unintended consequences of new media. Because guess what? That is continuing today. So open book, open notes, and I will post the study guide with answers when we're done. And again, I'm more or less writing a lot of new questions for the test right off of the study guide and making sure that I have definitively one real answer and no ambiguous ones. I'm trying to do it.
Thank you. You said this every test.
Yeah, I'm trying.
Right now.
So, yep. So it's real straightforward. Most of this stuff, again, the last 2 chapters were really kind of, there's a lot more theory in it. This is a little bit more nuts and bolts, and a little less application. So you all should do fine. Anyway, from the top, status of free speech in the US in 1800, shortly after the Revolution, was free speech was more of a concept. Still figuring out what it means on a case-by-case basis. The one thing they agreed on no prior restraint. Now, anybody remember what prior restraint is from the last test?
Government censorship of anything before it is published or broadcast.
Very good, Clinton. So there may be a question or two from previous things, just to reinforce them. So, okay, no prior restraint. So one thing that they considered, media bias. Media bias was expected. That is one thing, even throughout the 19th century. that free speech gave you the freedom to have a bias, had the freedom to say difficult things, the freedom to be wrong. So yeah, everyone knew whatever you say it's going to have a bias. All of this professional stuff about media bias and ethics, that starts in the 20th century, and that's what we'll start with next week after the test. Alien and Sedition Acts, 1798, allowed the government to jail people with whom they disagreed. Lincoln used it in the Civil War, jailed people just because they didn't like what they said, thinking that would be sedition. Sedition is overthrowing the country. Did we have some questions of sedition just a few months ago? I think we might have. See, a lot of this is still relevant. Where do you draw the line on sedition? Where do you say you can't say that when you're trying to overthrow the government? So that's something we're still wrestling with. So anyway, what it showed that the government showed there were limits on free speech. And what they are, we're still wrestling with. Word magazine means storehouse. Significant, early 1800s, magazines lasted longer and traveled further. They didn't fall apart. A lot of the early novels of this time, Hawthorne, Thoreau, people like that, wrote in magazines. So it really, Dickens was English, but he wrote in magazines. Those are the kind of things we remember. You know, I mentioned Visit from St. Nicholas, also from a magazine. Those things were transmitted the culture, and because magazines held up longer, they went further. And that's Story House, Storehouse. Bad typists of the world untie. Okay, effects of the high-speed press, big time. This is one of the big ones, steam-powered high-speed press. We have increased literacy, more books and more hands. You know, if there's more books and newspapers available, more people are reading, especially among women, people of color, you know, so again, diversity comes in, you have different ideas. It's not just middle-aged or older white male property holders anymore. Different ideas start to come into play in society. And that makes a difference, as we shall see. The penny press comes from the high-speed press, because if you have more of anything, the price goes down. I wish it would be that way with gas. Well, that's one of the reasons going on with gas right now. Supply is less. Supply chain, all of that, so prices go up. The penny press means newspapers cheaper because of greater supply, driving down effects. Anybody? Remember, we went over this anyway, and it's in chapter 2 in Kavarik. Top of your heads. More paper, penny. Well, what that does is more people can read papers and get news. What kind of people? People who who don't have as much money. Again, minorities, immigrants, that just naturally brings more people into the democratic process. And the country starts changing. Again, it becomes less dominated by white male property owners who wrote the Constitution. So it makes a difference. And it is no coincidence. Social and political movements, the women's movement, first women's conference, I think was 1839, Chautauqua, New York. But you have your first, the women's movement. If women could read, why can't they participate more in society? Why can't they vote? Those questions really start to be asked by the people who are reading. Women's movement, abolitionism, the anti-slavery movement. Why would people in the North care about slavery in the South? Because they read about it. They read about it in the papers. They read about how horrible it was. And all of a sudden, people in New York or Pennsylvania are reading about what's happening in Virginia and South Carolina. And not only does that tie the country together, but it makes them aware of what's going on in the rest of the country. And again, no media bias. I mean, it is all biased. So they could be biased, they could crusade against slavery. Crusading newspapers was not considered biased at that point. So you have all sorts of new movements, new religions, Mormons. Joseph Smith had the Book of Mormon. Again, a book, a printed book that people can read that, hey, maybe this makes sense. So we have all sorts of new and different ideas coming into the American system. And America, again, being more literate and more urban than a lot of places in the rest of the world, that really, literacy really takes off here more than elsewhere. What did Samuel Morse invent? If you remember, was Wheatcroft and Gray in the UK who made the first practical telegraph system. And it was based in like a lot of the new things that we get in the 18th century on a lot of other innovations that were put together. He invented Morse code, the killer app. The whole point, it's not the technology, but what you put on it. The software. Morse code is software. It is, again, like a lot of these things in history, it is, we see these things happen again and again. Bill Gates in the 80s, he didn't invent the personal computer. He invented the operating system and Microsoft Word that I'm typing on to put on it. And we will see that again and again and again. Not just what you do, not just what you make, but what you put on the media makes all the difference. Okay. Political and economic impacts. Again, instant communication. Anybody, all of a sudden, things don't take 3 weeks to go across the world or across the country, takes a minute. What kind of things happened when you could do that? Okay, I'll tell you. Political and economic impacts. Political, again, things were closer. Distance didn't matter. You could get the same message from California that you got. Didn't matter much. Same message from California that you can get from down the street. So distance didn't matter. So far away places seemed closer. For example, the California Gold Rush. That's for whom the San Francisco 49ers are named. You have the Gold Rush. You have the Mexican War. You get dispatches, 1846 to 48, dispatches from the front. You learn what's going on. You get the news of the battles. The Mexican War was a border dispute in Texas, and we sent the army down and we won California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Colorado. So, you know, country became 1/3 bigger, and the telegraph had a lot to do with it, because you can get a message from Texas. You can get a message from California. Those things made a difference. Then other economics. Economic impacts. So yeah, you can get a mortgage, you can buy land in California or Nebraska if you live in Pennsylvania, fueling, again, westward movement. You can pay the same interest rates in various places. You can send money from California to New York. And because you could have messages at all hours, we start to think of time differently. You start to look at time zones, which had to do with the telegraph and the train. What time is the train going to get here? What time are your messages going to be here? What time is your business going to be open? And you can compare prices all over. You can compare prices in New York and Philadelphia. So our markets all become integrated. So it's a big economic impact just from that one wire. Unintended remember, unintended consequences. By the way, on the unintended consequences essays, a lot of you did really, really well. Several people went above and beyond and got 100s. That's great. The one big issue, and this will come in our other essays upcoming, the biggest thing is people wrote more than one essay. You say unintended consequences of the cell phone, cyberbullying, body image, and privacy. Each of those could be an essay unto themselves. A little bit more background and some examples. Each one is an essay. Cell phone and cyberbullying, cell phone and distracted driving. Go into depth with examples of each one and you'll have stronger essays. That was the one issue that came up repeatedly. Anyway, unintended consequences, one of those other things we talk about in this class is unintended consequences of the telegraph. Again, I talk about the night shift. If it's 9 a.m. in London, it's 3 a.m. here. So people had to start staying up at night. Women become telegraphers. You don't need, it's the same skill set. Women could do it just as well, if not better. They're not lifting rocks. So you would have more women coming into the market. So we have people working nights, more women coming in, so we have, again, more diversity in our economic system. Frederick Douglass, escaped, enslaved person. He wrote by himself his autobiography of what it was like to be an enslaved person. And that showed as anybody. He was a great speaker. He went out and he was, talked in a lot of abolition rallies against slavery, but he was also part of the early women's movement. He went out and, he went out, he appeared a lot in public, was a great speaker. And you look at him and say, hey, this is a really eloquent, learned person, not just some cartoon. So it really showed they were as good as anybody. Harriet Beecher Stowe, again, see, a lot of these things go together. High-speed press, very big selling book. Illustrates enslaved people as in-depth characters. These days, an Uncle Tom is sometimes a pejorative term, but he was in the book, if you read it, somebody who's wrestling with trying to keep his family together. I mean, these are complex characters, not just cartoons. So who want better lives. So it became a huge bestseller. And people in the North are starting to say, aha, enslaved people are real people, and everybody's reading it. And in 1863, when Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, people are ready for it because they see characters like Eliza and Uncle Tom as people that deserve to be free. Louis Daguerre, he did not invent photography, he perfected it. Demonstrated. And he did not hold on to the copyright. A lot of people worry about that. He didn't. Made him famous. Photography took off. He got to be a speaker. He didn't worry about license fees. He just said, just call it the daguerreotype. You know, he did that demonstration in Paris and said, voila, I have photography. And all of a sudden the world changes. New industry just takes off as quick as anything you see today. But he didn't invent photography. Like a lot of the inventions we'll talk about, it evolved over time, and it was his mentor, Nicéphore Niepce, who gave us the first photograph. Daguerre made it practical. And then he just opened it up to the world, and it took off like nothing. What difference does that make? Who is emotional? You might not understand the picture. I remember I showed you one of mine that kind of tells a story, but you know, you can make up your own story, but the reality is that people just didn't want their picture being taken. You make your own stories. You make storytelling, narrative becomes visual. You start, photographers are telling stories of what's happening in war or in politics, and you get that emotional impact. But it lacks context. You don't really necessarily know the whole story of what's going on, but you do go, oh, wow, when you see a picture. You still do today. You might not sure about exactly all of it, but you know, it becomes, you know, and I'll put it in quotes because they manipulated it from the beginning. People posed pictures, but there really is the president. Lincoln was very, very image conscious. He posed for lots of pictures, and so people knew who he was. You would see him everywhere. You don't see as many photos of Jefferson Davis or assorted Confederates because they weren't as media savvy. So the difference is, it again tells you, it gives you emotion, it tells you what's really happening, but it doesn't always give you the context. So we have a whole new way of looking at the world. Matthew Brady documented the realities portraits to make Lincoln, Grant. You knew who they were, but also pictures of horrors and bodies. Because you needed somebody to stand still to take a picture. What stands still? A dead body. And when you have that emotional impact of seeing a dead body, it's like, ugh, do I want to go there? Obviously not. You start having draft riots and some resistance to the war. So, you know, Lincoln was very aware, but he couldn't control everything, which is why you don't see again today pictures from Afghanistan, because bad things happen in war and the government doesn't want you to see it because they want you to support the war. The telegraph in the Civil War brought news directly to readers of newspapers. You get that front page, Gettysburg or Chattanooga, like that day. It really puts you there, ties the country together. All of a
The
sudden,
headlines.
what?
The headlines.
There you got them. Ties the country together. All of a sudden, what matters, what happens here matters in DC or New York. So yes, it brought right, and allows leaders to organize troops and supplies. Now, the North did a better job with that. The North was contiguous. They were smart enough to try to send armies to split up the Confederacy down the Mississippi, across from Chattanooga to Atlanta, separating all of that, separating the telegraph lines. And Tennessee's own Nathan Bedford Forrest would always cut the telegraph line so you couldn't get messages. So they were smart. But the North was, again, was contiguous. You can get messages back and forth. And if you remember, we had a film of Lincoln in the war room in the White House. He knew where everyone was all the time. Jefferson Davis did not know from Richmond, Virginia, what was happening in Texas or Mississippi, but Lincoln did, and that made a difference. How did Gettysburg Address go from a failed speech to a great one? Looked good in print. 260 words. Gets up, yada, 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 yada. Done in 15 minutes. No, done in 3-4 minutes. Done in just a few minutes. It's over. Plus he didn't, he had a high squeaky voice. But when you read it, it takes up just a box in the newspaper. Perfect size. You can read everything and everyone sees it and goes, whoa. So again, perfect for the media. And as time goes on, the sound bites get shorter and shorter and shorter. You put in a 10-second sound bite, or can be a long one. 30 seconds is usually a long shot. So yes, shorter stories all the time. Gettysburg Address was a great one. Who invented the telephone? Remember, and that was an extra credit one from last week. I gave it to you if you tried. But really, lots of people worked on it, but A.G. Bell got the patent. If you remember, Johann Rees, 20 years earlier, had a version of the phone. Nobody was interested. Antonio Meucci had a phone design. Elisha Gray was working on one simultaneously. But Bell got to the patent office and legally it was his invention. You know, the patents go to the person who can prove they've invented it. So a lot of people worked on it. Bell officially and legally is the inventor, but there was other folks who worked on it out there. We will see that in the next chapter a lot with radio and television. A lot of people working on this stuff. And so, yeah, so it starts to get complicated. Bell officially holds the patent, but other people worked on it too. Anyway, so that one may be a little ambiguous. What difference does the phonograph make? Media becomes sound oriented. You know, for millennia, it's just words and symbols and it's in your head. In the 19th century, we get photography, and then we get the phonograph. You can hear what other people sound like. Other voices, other cultures. Some of the first, the first popular recordings, you know, there's speeches, but music, opera music, which came from Italy and Germany, jazz music, blues, start influencing other cultures. So you get, again, diversity. It's not the same old stuff you hear in your church. It's other churches too. It's other theaters. So yes, you have other inputs. You know, sound is imagination. We'll talk a lot about that in radio, but it's starting with the phonograph. How did the phone affect other media? More immediate, because you didn't have a telegrapher giving you a telegraph. More immediate, direct, and personal. More information, because you could just tell them and they'll remember and they'll write down notes. They don't have to transcribe. More information. But it's direct. So if you can just call somebody else up, you have more sources of news, because you didn't have to wait for that telegraph anymore. You could just call them up. So we're getting more news from different places, more sources. So, and more of a personal relationship with them. Yellow journalism. The time after Civil War, when it became mass media, named for a cartoon character. Very little ethical considerations. Anything goes. You just print up, you made news, you sent your reporters out, Nellie Bly going around the world, Hearst sending somebody to a reporter to get an American spy in Cuba out of jail. You do whatever you want to sell papers. Again, newspapers become big. You have a real mass media, and you know, and it starts to influence things, and we'll get to that in a second. Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland, May have fathered a child out of wedlock became a campaign issue. Sex sells. You start getting salacious sexual stories. He was was with this woman who had a lot of friends, and she got pregnant. He was single at the time, so he said, okay, sure, I'll take care of it. Was the child his? We don't know. But it became a big scandal. Hearst was more Democratic. He supported Cleveland. Pulitzer supported his opponent, Blaine, and the papers just blew up all over it. And again, it raised readership. More people want to hear about this stuff. Our leaders become human. And again, sex, Spanish-American War. Papers promoted war based on flimsy. The battleship Maine. Battleship Maine blows up in Havana. We blame the Spanish. Look at, our ship was in the harbor. They blew up our ship. They asked for it. Let's invade Cuba, the Philippines, other Spanish colonies. Later, it does seem, never truly proven, evidence suggests that sailors were rolling their own and some ashes fell in the gunpowder, and so, but we used it to blame the Spanish and go to war. Then the newspapers, Hearst and Pulitzer, everybody's saying, well, let's get those Spanish. Have you heard about that lately? Now, most of you were probably kids, little kids when this happened, but we had the Iraq War based on weapons of mass destruction. The government reported, and the late Colin Powell, who just died, said it was his low point. We said that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, nukes, chemical and biological warfare. Not true. There were no weapons of mass destruction, but we didn't, you were considered unpatriotic if you questioned it. So we went along with it. So anyway, wars based on flimsy evidence, it happens. Anyway, so I mean, this is not just isolated from the yellow journalism period. It can happen today. Teddy Roosevelt. You see the picture of him charging up San Juan Hill on a horse? Didn't happen. San Juan Hill, African American troops covered him. He walked up, the troops stood on the side, and they shot at the Spanish, and he got to walk up. He later staged the charge on a horse for the cameras, and that's what we see. Robin Williams, when he played Teddy Roosevelt in those Night at the Museum movies, he's on a horse. Didn't happen. Again, but a war needs a hero. He staged his public image so he could be the big war hero. He got elected governor of New York, vice president, and then when the president died, he became president. Alexander Graham's role in media behind his inventing of the phone, inventing of phone. I'll put that in quotations. Invented a phone company and started National Geographic magazine. The big thing is, again, you have the patent, then you control the distribution system. So you had to go through Bell to get the wires and the system and the phone numbers to use your phone. So that was, you know, so more than that, National Geographic magazine, now run by Fox. Oh, well. Effects of society, more personal communication. In the past, all you could do is write a letter or talk. You're using the media to talk like a text. So people get closer. And as I said above, more diverse news and info from different sources. Early inventions have in society. Graph, new voices and culture, industry. And what I'm really getting at here, invented the electrical grid. Even though we use Tesla's system of alternating current, the whole idea of switches and wires and all over, that was Edison. So we invented the electrical grid and the electric company. The electric company, 50 years ago, kid show, I liked it. Speaking.
It's not too hard to see, it's silent E.
Speaking of the phonograph, Emil Berliner invented the disc playing gramophone. And that's the system we work today. Edison's phonograph was on a wax cylinder. Wax melts. Plastic disc, you can reproduce and make records and pass them around and they hold up. Went from plastic discs to the CD players in the 90s and 2000s. And in this computer, we still have a hard disk. The disk came from Emil Berliner. Again, somebody who, somebody who perfected a system that was already existing. Light bulb of the telegraph. Communication across time zones. Time zones. And thus you need light. So you needed the light bulb because you're working nights. I mean, it's a small example of how all these different inventions work together to make a new world. Muckraking is showing societal problems. Things like child labor. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle about working conditions. The Jungle talked about the meat packing industry. So those, all of a sudden, we expose problems in society. That leads to the Safe Food Act. It brings us to child labor laws. You have crusading news people going out and exposing bad stuff. But we have questions of bias still. These things are not necessarily black and white. So what we face today, even better conditions, mean goods cost more. Adults got to be paid more than children. So the price of clothes goes up. Look at today, we have trouble finding restaurant workers. You pay people better, the price of a meal goes up. Treating people better costs money. And so we're still wrestling with that balancing act. Now, in those days, it was pretty one-sided. Nowadays, you get a little bit more of different perspectives. But so much of this is about how technology works together, how technology has unintended consequences, and how technology really affects us. That's really the story of the 19th century. And another thing, as literacy grows, more people come into the system. At what point are there too many people and too many viewpoints, too much misinformation, making things unwieldy? And that's another balancing act we still have trouble today. Access versus chaos, power versus limits, like yellow journalism. Where do you draw the line? Who gets to limit irresponsible journalism? Those are the questions. Once we have this big medium coming out, which is print at the time, coming out of the 19th century, the 20th century is more technology, but also what to do about it. So that's what we're covering. I will post this with answers. Save as. It's got a with answers. So the test will be open. I haven't finished it yet. I'm still working on some bits and pieces and making sure there's no ambiguity. There's definitely a right answer, that it's real straightforward, and it's largely from the study guide, from the class notes that I'm posting, from the books and lectures. It's all, a lot of it should be fairly repetitious, because we're just hitting some big themes here again and again. And so, keep to the big picture. Largely what we have here, most of it's from the study guide, from the book, from the lectures, from the videos. Look at these things, take your time, breathe. And if you have any questions at all, contact me. I'm there for you. Thursday, a lot of you work or have other classes, so use this time to take the test Thursday. I'll be around if you want, but nothing new, no Zoom meeting on Thursday. All right? Questions? Everything pretty good? I think you all are on top of it. It has been a pleasure. Let me record. Let me record and post this, and I'll be around. Have a good few days. Talk to you all soon. Peace out.